So Catherine, thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to SFHA's AGM, and we very much look forward to hearing from you, and I'll pass over control to you now.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah, and absolutely lovely to be here. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'll assume that someone will shout if the slides aren't visible. But I'm really excited to be talking with you today at your AGM, partly because I think there's such a resonance between your work and that wider agenda of building a wellbeing economy. And I think in a way we can sum that up in the difference between homes and houses. In a way, houses, the inequality in the housing market, in a way, is such a root cause of the various layers of injustice that create the demand and the need for a wellbeing economy. I think the idea of homes, in a way, in contrast to houses, speaks of the resistance to the financialization agenda. I mean, no one talks about home price rises, do they? It's always housing price rises. Houses, of course, are framed as a source of investment, a source of rent, unearned income. Whereas when we think about homes, that's where we're thinking about our shelter, a space we can be ourselves, build our confidence, raise a family, engage with the community. And so I think in a way that idea of houses vis-a-vis homes speaks to the sort of wider transition we need to make across the economic system. So I'm going to talk you through that now and start by taking a bit of a bird's eye view of the wider macroeconomy that really gives us this need, gives us this context in which we need to think about a different economic system. And in a way, I like to think of the current story, the current setup of our economic systems and our social policy as what I describe as the long road option. So this is a three-step situation where essentially the first goal is get the economy to grow bigger. And we measure that, of course, by gross domestic product. But so often we don't pay so much attention to the damage that that agenda does to people and to planet. And then stage two of this long road option is sequester some of that growth back through taxes, and you understand all the political machinations and leakage through tax evasion and avoidance that comes with that. And then step three is use some of that money through taxes to help the economy or help society and the planet deal with the damage that came from step one. So that's the long road option. In a way, that's the current effective implicit settlement that we've got in society and politics today. But the challenge is that doesn't take account of some very present realities. And to give you a few examples, one, it doesn't take account of essentially what the UN General Secretary is describing as a code red for humanity. The fact that our precious natural home, planet Earth, cannot take more and more of our current production and consumption systems. We're seeing scientists make the link between the environmental catastrophe, the environmental crisis, and economic growth more and more. So that long road option doesn't take account of that. It also doesn't take account of this idea of diminishing marginal returns, that essentially the benefits of economic growth in terms of various social dimensions, social progress, start to tail off. And I could share with you various charts that take a similar pattern of benefits at early stages of economic growth that then start to tail off as you progress through more and more economic growth, measured here in GDP per capita, vis-a-vis life expectancy. You can see that at early stages of economic growth, you do get various returns in terms of increased life expectancy, but those benefits start to tail off. That's this idea of diminishing marginal returns. I could have shown you charts that replaced on the y-axis things like poverty reduction, literacy rates, various aspects of social progress, and happy to come back to that in the Q&A later. But the point is that the benefits of economic growth start to tail off. The long road option also doesn't take account of the extent of failure demand. Now, this, of course, is a concept that many Scottish folks will be familiar with, given the Christie Review, and we've just celebrated 10 years of the Christie Review, that essentially reminded us that so much of state spending at various layers of government is driven by our collective failure to create societies that deliver justice and beneficial outcomes from the beginning, and happens is we turn to government to spend money to heal and fix and repair, essentially reactive immigration spending. To give you a couple of examples, we've got a report coming out next month that hopefully you'll all be interested in, where we've made an attempt to try to track some of that spending through the Scottish budget and the Albertan government budget as well. So we've got that contrast between Scotland and Canada. And we've calculated that in Scotland, because of low pay, various levels of the state, so it's including UK, but also local government, have to spend almost over 800 million a year because of low pay in things like welfare, in terms like free school meals, in terms of responding to work-related ill health. If we turn to the environmental side of things, ecological economists will talk about defensive expenditure, and you will all have examples of this in your own mind, in your own lives, of spending that we have to do in response to catastrophic weather events, whether it's cleaning up after an oil spill or rebuilding after a bushfire, for example. It's very present for me, seeing what happened to my home country about 18 months ago. And we've also made an attempt to calculate some of those figures for Scotland. And in Scotland, there's various levels of the state have had to spend over $2.5 billion annually responding to the damage that fossil fuel extraction creates, whether it's responding to damage driven by global warming, responding to air pollution, so you can imagine the health benefits of that, congestion, road damage, those sorts of things. To give you another example, in Australia, the government reduces economic inequality through taxes and welfare transfers by about 40%. So that's a huge lift for government, because the market, the economy in itself, doesn't deliver more equal outcomes from the beginning. In a way, these sort of examples are a bit like an onion, and you'll all recognize them when you're looking at news headlines or various policy announcements. So much of what our social policy agenda is focused on is driven by failure demand, essentially responding to the economic system. So what can we imagine differently? This is this idea that we're talking about now, that could we recognize that the job of economic growth has been done? And so that in a sense that we've arrived, and what we now need to do is embark on a new task. And essentially that's to make ourselves at home with the wealth that we've created. And that is about building a wellbeing economy. Now, the simplest way to describe a wellbeing economy is essentially about social justice on a healthy planet and having an economic system that's designed for that goal. I want to put it in these words of one of my heroes, Kirsty Flanagan from the Linwood Community Development Trust. And she says, what does a wellbeing economy mean for us? It's when you're able to develop assets that meet the real needs of our community. She gives the example of a single mum who approached her organisation saying, can we have some space so that we can support families and young people deal with their addictions and their mental health challenges? Kirsty says it's about equality, it's about recognition and respect, it's about empowerment and trust. And we can talk a little bit more about the ideas of the wellbeing economy later. But I want to skip through to how can we go about building an economy that's in service of what people and planet need. And the challenging reality is that it's not an easy flick of a light switch. There's not one policy, one silver bullet that will do this for us. I think it's more helpful to think about almost a jigsaw puzzle of different policy shifts at all levels of the economic system, right up from the macroeconomy, through how we design our taxes, our infrastructure, through to individual projects. But as all good jigsaw puzzlers will know, you of course start with the corners. So I want to give you 4 Ps that to me perhaps are the corners of the jigsaw puzzle that will help us build a wellbeing economy. And these are about purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and making sure it's people powered. So I'll talk through those very briefly now in turn. So when we're thinking about purpose, the current system, of course, is a growth-orientated, growth-dependent economic system. And to move to a wellbeing economy, we need to shift our focus from seeing economic growth as a goal and objective in its own right, to being fair weather friends of economic growth rather than its ever faithful followers. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, it's about understanding the difference between means and ends. And I suspect this will all seem pretty basic to you, but it still baffles me how in our political conversations in Scotland today, we seem to tangle up means and ends. because we hear the economy and growth talked about as an objective in its own right, rather than one of many strategies to deliver what it is we're really after, a wellbeing economy that's about social justice on a healthy planet. So the question needs to be flipped to what's the role of the economy in delivering those higher order goals? And this means that we, instead of just focusing on the rate of GDP growth, we need to think about the composition and direction of that growth. What do we need more of? Who needs that? What direction is it going in, rather than just incremental increases in GDP? And as opposed to, you hear when people talking about economic recovery, it's constantly framed in terms of incremental increases of GDP. What's happening to growth in the last quarter? What we need to be asking is, what sort of economy is emerging after the pandemic that delivers social justice on a healthy planet for Scotland? So that's the first P in terms of purpose. The next one is in terms of prevention. This is about being more ambitious than just contenting ourselves with that reactive downstream failure demand spending that's responding to the fallout of our current economic system. Prevention is saying we're going to look at those symptoms and we're going to ask, why were they created? What's the root cause of them? And focus our attention there. This means moving away from just helping individuals survive and cope with the current economic system, being much more ambitious, understanding the systemic structural features that drive some of the challenges today. It means not just focusing on individuals, but focusing on relationships, focusing on the macroeconomy, questions of distribution, ownership and power. And one of the examples of that is if we're thinking about how we do our budgets in Scotland, if we're thinking about a wellbeing budget, that's focusing on outcomes rather than just pounds and spending lines. And it's quite a profound shift in terms of that longer term, holistic approach to delivering outcomes rather than just individual spending lines that are so often driven by reactive response to the collateral damage of the current economic system. So that's prevention. And I think all these P's will have resonance with housing associations. We can talk about that a little more. So the third P is about pre-distribution, which is a fairly clunky term, but to me, I think it's the most exciting concept because it's essentially saying, how can the economy do more of the heavy lifting in terms of delivering those sorts of social just, sustainable outcomes that we really want from the beginning? These are questions around ownership, who owns wealth, who owns firms. It's questions around how we price our goods and services. Do they take into account the environmental input, the social input in terms of how we've created goods and services? Do they pay people fairly? What are the costs that people are facing? Do they reflect really the environmental price, or are things artificially cheap? So we're distorting decisions by consumers. It's about sorts of business models. Are businesses designed just to extract a quick buck? Or are they about really attending to social and environmental benefits and using commercial viability as a means to do that? It's also about community wealth building, an agenda that's really building momentum in Scotland at the moment. And essentially, how can we harness local economic multipliers to generate the sort of outcomes and keep money circulating locally so they benefit local communities, local firms, local employees from the beginning? And in a way, this is one of the hallmarks of the wellbeing economy agenda, that it's about design of the economy rather than just discussing what we spend on sticking plasters through failure demand and defensive expenditure. It's saying, how can we restructure and reorientate our economic systems so they deliver the outcomes that we really want? So that's the third P, the third corner of our jigsaw. And the fourth is that it has to be people powered. This cannot be an economic system that is designed and controlled by remote decisions taken in far off corporate boardrooms. This has to have people at the heart of how we structure and design, envision the purpose of the economy. And so this is things like participatory budgeting, participatory planning, economic democracy within our firms. Also things like, how do we augment our rather thin representative modes of democratic decision-making with more robust, authentic, participatory ways of doing decision-making, such as citizens' assemblies that we've seen Scotland's got a really good track record of here. And so they're the 4 Ps. And I think they all really resonate with the work of housing associations in Scotland. And I want to give you an example of that. So if we're thinking about that transition from houses to homes, what's the old way? What's the old paradigm's way of delivering those? So the old mode is we had fairly uninsulated, energy inefficient housing. We often have access to housing rationed by price and ability to pay, and houses used as investment advices to make rentiers more money. The transition, the possibility with that homes orientation is sustainable design, co-housing, and more publicly and community-owned housing. But I also want to share with you my thinking around the role of housing associations as speaking to this wider wellbeing economy agenda. And this comes to our mindsets. In a way, the old way is essentially, there is no alternative. Don't be so naive to ask these questions about the economic system. It's a heretical question to say maybe we could design an economy that's better than economic growth. And believe me, I have been called naive and heretical for asking these sorts of questions. The new way is about saying, actually, there are thousands of alternatives to the current economic system, and we see them in microcosm all around the planet at the moment. It's also about recognizing that how we design our economies is absolutely in our control. This is not like gravity that we can't control. It's about political decisions to reshape our economic systems. And it's about saying we can have economies that are designed in a way to deliver human and ecological well-being as their goal. And where I think housing associations come in is because not only do you exemplify the provisioning mode of a well-being economy by delivering for people as they need, about building community, not having price and markets as the ultimate determination, but I think you prefigure that wider change, and we need that wider mindset shift. And so housing associations essentially are more important than just your provisioning role, because what you do is you essentially show the feasibility and the desirability of a different way of doing things. And why we need to be asking these major questions about the economy, I think we can be really inspired by William Beveridge, and this was him writing in the midst of the Second World War. These are on the front pages of the document that set in train the mechanics and the architecture for our social security system and the National Health Service. And he wrote, in the midst of the Second World War, a revolutionary moment in the world's history, of which we are absolutely now, today, in 2020-21 in, is a time for revolution, not for patching. He's essentially saying we need to do better than just that downstream failure demand spending. We need to look upstream for those root causes, and that's when you find yourself facing the economic system. And if we're taking that clarion call seriously, then we need to think about large-scale system change. And this is my last slide, and I just want to share with you this post-it note that was put on the wall of a workshop several years ago, because I think it sums up beautifully what you can be thinking about in your discussions in everyday work, and when you're setting the vision for your organizations around how housing associations can contribute to the large-scale change that we need. And this note was saying to achieve this sort of scale, yes, it's difficult, but it will be achieved through relationships, championship, legitimacy, patience, purpose, and passion. And if you take those into the discussions around how you about your daily work, how you set the 5-10-year plans for your organization, we will get much more firmly onto the road of building the sort of economy that people and planet really need. Sarah, I'm going to stop there, but looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Katherine, thanks. That was, excellent, captivating. I can't believe how quickly that went. I was gripped from the first slide. A couple of points. I think that code red for humanity that you mentioned, and also that quote towards the end around this revolutionary moment that we find ourselves in. And I think we're all starting to feel the effects of that as we kind of transition out of the pandemic into don't waste this opportunity for change and just the opportunity that we have right now. I've got a couple of questions that are coming in from the SFHA team, but just as a reminder to all participants that you can ask questions using the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom of your control panel. So one of the first questions, I suppose, around the economy and growth as an objective in its own right, you spoke about that and how we need to kind of get away from that narrative. So given the constant political pressure for economic growth, how do we persuade policymakers that a well-being economy is needed?
Oh, lovely question. So this afternoon, or early this evening, we are having the first meeting of a cross-party parliamentary group on the wellbeing economy. So, and I'd love SFHA to be part of that, or any of your organisations as well. Today's just the first meeting, but we hope it'll just to appoint office bearers and so on. But we hope in future you'd feel so welcome to be part of that. And essentially, we're hoping to use that mechanism to really essentially educate our politicians on some of these realities, to share hope, to show examples of what's happening in practice already, because I think it's a rare politician who wants to be ahead of the curve. I often think Scotland sometimes is racing to be second. And so the good thing is there are plenty of examples around the world, but also in microcosm in Scotland, where we can show this is what it looks like. This is what it entails in microcosm. And so hoping to harness that cross-party parliamentary group, but it's also through all your conversations in your respective spheres of influence with your families, with your colleagues, to open up that discussion so it's no longer dismissed as naive or unrealistic or politically infeasible, to ask these sorts of questions and to ask, can we have a bigger objective for our economy? I'm really heartened by the findings and the recommendations of some of the recent citizens' assemblies that we've had in Scotland, where it shows that where people, if they're given the time and the space to reflect and discuss with each other, where they have evidence provided to meet their needs and feed into those conversations, but it's not experts on top. When they have those deliberative processes that are inherent in a citizens' assembly, the recommendations, the ambition they come out with is very, very bold. And I think if our politicians took that more seriously, they'd know that this idea that the public are not up for that is no excuse, because in the right circumstances, when there's a chance for dialogue, actually the public really are up for this, and they probably want politicians to be a lot bolder than they currently are.
And we've got another question coming in from Craig Stirrett, who's the Chief Executive of Grampian, one of SFHA's members. Craig had said, excellent presentation, Catherine. The gap between the haves and have-nots is growing. How can RSLs help influence local economies to close this gap rather than prop up dependency?
Oh, thanks, Craig. I mean, I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of, one, that role I was talking about earlier in terms of provisioning that's not based on market power. And I think we see that at the moment. So much of how we divvy up and provide services that people really need are rationed by price. And I think that's why I really feel the prefiguring role of housing associations is perhaps more important than you may give yourselves credit for, because you have for decades been proving that this is possible, that there are ways to design businesses that are social enterprise orientated. Of course, you're commercially viable and commercially profitable, but you're doing so not to make a profit to extract. You're doing so in order to meet the needs of your members, your tenants, your communities. And so I'd say just harness that, but think perhaps who your constituency is. And obviously tenants are going to be the first one, the first obvious constituency. And this speaks to the wider role approach that I think a lot of you have been working on for the last few decades. Who else is beyond that? And is our sphere of influence wider? So can you make the most of, say, opening up some physical assets for things like tool libraries or toy libraries, those sorts of things where, again, we're not providing on an ability to pay, but we're having the more collaborative sharing economy. So just think laterally about what assets that you've got at your fingertips and could they be utilised a bit more creatively. But I really suspect this is the sort of stuff you're doing anyway. And what I'd like to really impart is this idea that let's illuminate the work you're doing as not just in its own right being important, but because it shows us the possibility of a different way of designing the economic system that others need to emulate.
Thanks, Catherine. We've got two more questions, so I think we should have just about enough time to get them through. Again, our Director of Public Affairs and Communications, Carolyn Lockhead, has asked the question, and I think it's very much related to that Code Red for humanity and Code Red on sort of environmental impact. And, you know, you mentioned something around the Earth being our greatest home and how are we going to look after the planet? So sort of linked to that in terms of that, you know, the reach for net zero carbon emissions. Given that urgent need, how best can we achieve this in social housing without pushing people into fuel poverty because of higher bills?
Yeah, great question. And I suspect a lot of people on this call will probably have more technical expertise on this question than I will. But one, in terms of energy efficiency standards, design of buildings, all these things need to come into play. And actually, one of the recommendations from Scotland's recent climate assembly was really to raise the eco standards for Scotland's building stock and also new builds, really moving towards a passive home standard. So thinking about how can we make the most of how we design, build, retrofit homes as well. And of course, you'll all be familiar with essentially these ideas that are inherent in the Green New Deal agenda, that who is it who's delivering those? Can we get some benefits that are not just from the environmental side of things? Can they also be provisioned in a way that provide training and employment outcomes for people who perhaps haven't been able to access those in the past? And in a way, the Green New Deal is a nice way of describing the sort of things that housing associations have been doing for decades in terms of intermediate labour market outcomes. We've been using that training, provisioning, efficiency, eco-efficiency standards to give jobs and training to people perhaps slightly from the labour market. And essentially, it's this agenda that says communities and groups that have been most shafted by the old economic system need to be first served by how we go about building the current one. And so designing building stock differently, I think, is a really, and do that retrofitting and how we construct and provide future homes and housing is doing so in a way that delivers multiple benefits. So it's not just the environmental outcomes, the social outcomes at the same time. But I'd also encourage you to just tap into the expertise. There are lots of really creative architects and designers out there who are thinking very laterally about reusing materials, repurposing them. And so tap into some of those experts who are out there who are sort of bringing their knowledge to bear on how we design and build homes that meet the needs of 21st century agenda rather than old school.
Katherine, I'm going to push my luck and get one more question in before we break, because I think it's a great question that's come in from Glenn Adcock, who is the Chief Exec at Osprey Housing Association. So Glenn has said, great to listen to you again, Katherine. Social injustice and inequality is well documented in Scotland and the UK, but isn't recognised politically in the way we need it to be, as you have just said. It is, however, that part of the problem, and that is difficult to grasp conceptually at a pragmatic level, and potentially too difficult to see how to transition to. So I suppose a bit more of an observation. I just wondered if you had any reflection on Glenn's comment.
Yeah, partly I just sort of feel like commiserating with him on the reality of that, because yeah, this isn't a new conversation. I mean, people have been highlighting the extent of injustice in our society for decades. I think in a way we've been trapped in that downstream sticking plaster space. And I think I often talk, I don't know if some of you will have grandchildren or children or nieces and nephews who are at that sort of 4 or 5 year old age. And my little nephew, when he was 4, he was at that really annoying age where he's constantly saying, yeah, but why? But why? But why? We need to be like my little nephew. And so not just ask, why were food banks rising? Why is in-work poverty rising? Why are so many people stressed and anxious? Why are we seeing more floods and more levels of extreme heat? Why is it? And so not just being stuck in the emergency response, vital though that is, so I'd never want to denigrate that essentially humanitarian response that is so important. But we need to be like our 4-year-old nieces, nephews, grandchildren, daughters, sons, and ask, but why? And look upstream. And I think that's the conversation Scotland needs, because we're not short of recognition that this is important and it's a cause for concern and it's a blight on Scotland. But we need to take ourselves into the conversation where we look upstream at the root causes and pay more attention there, and also create the political space for politicians to walk into that. At the moment, we're so often focused around how much money are we spending on benefits, how much money are we spending on top-up payments, how much money are we spending on, hospitals and the police. actually, we need to be saying maybe in a well-being economy, there'll be fewer police because people feel safer. Maybe once we're out of the pandemic, we could even imagine fewer need for hospitals because people be healthier in their communities from the get-go, rather than just being stuck on that downstream spending. So I think that's a conversation it behoves all of us to have, but also to buy politicians that space so they can step into that and not be stuck in that annual, yearly sort of responsiveness mode that I think traps us in just putting sticking plasters on the current economic system.